August 15th, 778. The Pyrenees Mountains. The afternoon sun hung low over the narrow mountain pass of Roncevaux, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain where pine forests clung to steep slopes. The air was thin and cool at this altitude, carrying the scent of mountain herbs and distant snow. Through this treacherous corridor, the rear guard of Charlemagne's army moved in a long, winding column. Thousands of Frankish warriors, their armor gleaming dully in the fading light. Their horses heavy laden with the spoils of a Spanish campaign. The clatter of iron horseshoes against stone echoed through the valley, a metallic rhythm that spoke of confidence, of imperial might returning home. These were the soldiers of the greatest Christian king in Western Europe, veterans of countless battles, men who had marched all the way to the gates of Zaragoza and back. They moved with the casual certainty of an army that believed itself invincible. Count Roland rode near the front of this rear column, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword, Durendal, his eyes scanning the forested slopes with the practiced gaze of a seasoned commander. Around him marched the paladins, the greatest knights of Francia, men whose names would echo through history. They wore the finest armor their empire could forge, carried weapons blessed by bishops, and moved under banners that proclaimed the authority of a king who styled himself as the new Augustus, the defender of Christendom. The column stretched 4 miles, a serpent of steel and flesh winding through the mountain pass, vulnerable in its length, but confident in its strength. Above them, invisible in the dense forest cover, other eyes were watching. Eyes that had watched these mountains for generations. Eyes that saw not an invincible army, but an opportunity written in the arrogance of empire. This was the moment when the dreams of Charlemagne's Spanish ambition would collide with a force the Franks had never truly understood. The Basques, a people, older than Rome itself, who knew these mountains as intimately as a mother knows her child. What would unfold in the next hours would not be remembered as a conventional battle. There would be no grand formations, no trumpet calls signaling the advance of massed cavalry, no bishops blessing the troops before a glorious charge. What was coming was something far more primal, far more terrifying, a lesson in the limits of imperial power, delivered by ghosts who fought without banners and disappeared into the landscape like smoke. The Frankish fire empire in 778 stood at the zenith of its power. Charlemagne, king of the Franks and Lombards, had spent 2 decades building something unprecedented in Straumen, Europa Christian empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Danube, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. He was not merely a barbarian king squatting in the ruins of civilization. He was a visionary who saw himself as the heir to Rome itself, the secular sword of the Church, the protector of Christian civilization against the encroaching darkness of paganism and Islam. His armies had crushed the Saxons in the north, absorbed the Lombards in Italy, and pushed back the Avars in the east. He commanded perhaps 70,000 warriors, controlled hundreds of monasteries that served as centers of learning and administration, and could call upon the loyalty of dukes, counts, and bishops across a territory larger than any European power since the fall of the Western Roman Empire 400 years earlier. The Spanish campaign of 778 had seemed like a natural extension of this inexorable expansion. Right of Córdoba, the great Muslim power in Iberia, had fractured into civil war. A Muslim governor named Suleiman al-Arabi, ruling Barcelona and other cities in the Spanish March, had traveled all the way to Charlemagne's court at with an offer that must have seemed like divine providence. Help us against our enemies, and we will open the gates of our cities to your army. The prospect was intoxicating. Here was an opportunity to push Christian power deep into Muslim Spain. to secure the southern frontier of Francia, to win glory and treasure, and perhaps even souls for Christ. The chroniclers who accompanied Charlemagne's army wrote of it as a crusade before crusades had a name. A holy war to reclaim lands that had been Christian before the Muslim conquest of the 8th century. Charlemagne had assembled a massive force for the campaign, perhaps the largest army he had ever commanded. Frankish heavy cavalry, the shock troops of early medieval warfare, formed the core of his forces. These were men who had trained since childhood to fight on horseback, who wore chainmail that could turn most blows, who carried lances and swords, forged by the finest smiths in Christendom. Supporting them were infantry levies from across the empire: Bavarians, Alemannians, Burgundians, Aquitanians, men who owed military service to their lords and ultimately to the king. The baggage train that followed this host stretched for miles, carrying not just weapons and armor, but the administrative machinery of empire scribes to record victories, priests to celebrate masses, treasurers to count the expected plunder. The army had crossed the Pyrenees in the spring, moving through the western passes with the confidence of a power that had forgotten what it meant to face serious resistance. They had marched down into the Ebro Valley, expecting cities to open there. Gates, as promised. Zaragoza, the great prize, was supposed to surrender without a fight. But reality had proven more complex than the promises made in distant Paderborn. Suleiman al-Arabi's enemies were not as weak as advertised, and his allies were not as reliable. When the Frankish army arrived at the walls of Zaragoza, they found the gates closed and the battlements manned. The city would not fall through negotiation, and Charlemagne, whose empire was built on mobility and rapid victories, had neither the time nor the resources for a prolonged siege in hostile territory. Hundreds of miles from his supply bases, the decision to retreat was pragmatic but costly to imperial pride. Charlemagne's army had marched deep into Spain and achieved nothing of strategic value. They had burned some Muslim villages, extorted some tribute from fearful towns, and demonstrated that Frankish power could reach even here, but they had not taken Zaragoza. They had not established a permanent Christian presence south of the Pyrenees, and they had not delivered the crushing victory that would have justified the enormous expense of the campaign. As the army turned north toward home, there was anger in the ranks. Soldiers who had marched hundreds of miles expected plunder, glory, and tales to tell their grandchildren. Instead, they were trudging back toward Francia with empty hands and wounded pride. Then came a decision that would haunt Charlemagne for the rest of his life. As the Frankish army passed through Christian Basque territories, on its way back to the Pyrenees, it encountered the city of Pamplona, Basque, Christian, and theoretically neutral in the conflict between Franks and Muslims. But neutrality meant little to an army frustrated by failure and hungry for something to show for its efforts. The sources are unclear on exactly what happened, but the outcome is not disputed. Pamplona's walls were razed to the ground. Whether this was punishment for refusing to provide supplies, a demonstration of Frankish power, or simple revenge for a humiliating campaign, the result was the same. The Franks had just made enemies of the one people whose cooperation they needed to safely cross back over the Pyrenees. They had struck at the pride of a warrior culture that had survived Roman conquest, Visigothic rule, and Muslim invasion. By knowing when to bend and when to break, the Basques would remember Pamplona, and the mountains provided endless opportunities for memory to become vengeance. The Frankish soldiers moving through Roncevaux pass that August afternoon expected nothing more dangerous than steep trails and tired horses. They had left the war behind in Spain. They were in Christian territory now, technically within the sphere of Frankish influence, moving through lands that had acknowledged Charlemagne's overlordship, even if that acknowledgement was often more theoretical than practical. The rear guard, commanded by Roland, warden of the Breton March, and one of Charlemagne's most trusted paladins, comprised some of the finest warriors in the army. These were not raw levies or hastily assembled militias. These were professional soldiers, nobles, and their retinues. Men who had fought in a dozen campaigns and survived because they were skilled, vigilant, and well-equipped. But they were not prepared for what the Basques had planned. How could they be? The Frankish way of war was built on mass and momentum-heavy cavalry charges. Shield walls, the coordinated movement of large formations in open terrain. It was a system designed for the battlefields of northern Europe, where armies met in farmland and river valleys, where victory went to whoever could maintain discipline and cohesion under pressure. The Franks had refined this system over centuries, had used it to break Saxon shield walls and smash Lombard armies. They understood siege warfare. They understood cavalry tactics. They understood the logistics of moving thousands of men across hundreds of miles. What they did not understand, what no amount of training in the flatlands of Francia could teach them, was how to fight in mountains against an enemy who refused to present a target. The Basques were not an army in any sense. The Franks would recognize. They had no king to challenge, no capital to capture, no banners to rally around. They were farmers and shepherds, traders and craftsmen, who had lived in these mountains since before history began. They spoke a language unrelated to any other. In Europe, a tongue that predated the Romans and would outlast empires. They worshipped as Christians, but their Christianity was layered over older beliefs, older loyalties to the land and to kinship groups that transcended any king's authority. More importantly, they knew these mountains in a way the Franks never could. They knew which trails led to dead ends, which slopes would avalanche with the right pressure, which forest clearings provided perfect ambush sites. They knew how sound carried in the valleys, how to move through dense undergrowth without making noise, how to read the weather and use fog and shadow to mask their movements. They had no need for the heavy armor that made Frankish knights so formidable in open battle armor that became a liability in steep terrain. That made men slow and clumsy when agility meant survival. The Basques fought with javelins and short swords, with bows and slings, weapons that could be used while moving. That didn't require formation, fighting, or coordinated charges. The Frankish column stretched for miles through the pass, a tactical nightmare that any competent commander would have recognized as vulnerable. But Charlemagne himself was already far ahead with the main body of the army, descending the northern slopes of the Pyrenees toward the relative safety of Aquitaine. The rear guard had been given the unglamorous but supposedly safe task of shepherding. The baggage train, the carts, loaded with supplies. The pack animals carrying equipment. The moving city of camp followers and servants that accompanied any medieval army. It was a position of trust given to reliable commanders, but not one that suggested any expectation of combat. The war was over. They were going home. The Basques watched the column move deeper into the pass, watched the shadows lengthen, watched the distance grow between the rear guard and any possible reinforcement from the main army. They had been gathering for days, small groups of warriors moving silently through paths that did not appear on any map, converging on Roncevaux from a dozen different valleys and villages. There was no supreme commander coordinating this assault. No war council making strategic decisions. There didn't need to be. The Basques were acting on the oldest of motivations, for a city destroyed, anger at an invasion of their territory, and the practical calculation that the Frankish baggage train represented wealth beyond anything their mountain communities normally saw. Here were horses and armor, weapons and gold, supplies and equipment worth more than most Basque villages would produce in a year. Here was the empire that thought it could march through their lands with impunity, rape and pillage, and burn its way to Spain and back without consequence. The attack, when it came, erupted from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The Basques fell upon the rear guard not as an organized army, but as a swarm, materializing from the forest and the rocks, like the mountain itself had turned hostile. They came from above, rolling stones and tree trunks down the steep slopes, crushing men and horses in chaos and confusion. They came from the flanks, javelins arcing out of the tree line to punch through chainmail and leather, finding gaps in armor with the accuracy of men who had hunted mountain game all their lives. They came from behind, cutting off any retreat back toward Spain, turning the narrow pass into a killing ground with no escape. The Frankish rear guard tried to form up, tried to implement the training and discipline that had won them countless victories. But formation fighting requires space and visibility, requires the ability to see your enemy and coordinate with your comrades. In the narrow defile of Roncevaux, pressed on all sides by forest and rock, the Frankish advantages evaporated. Heavy cavalry couldn't charge uphill through dense undergrowth. Shield walls couldn't form when the enemy was above you, and behind you, and all around you simultaneously. The very armor that made Frankish warriors so formidable became weighed down by chainmail, couldn't scramble up rocky slopes to come to grips with enemies who danced away before any counterattack could develop. Count Roland, the sources tell us, died in that chaos. The greatest of Charlemagne's paladins, the hero who would later become the central figure of medieval epic poetry, died fighting enemies who wouldn't stand still long enough to be killed in honorable combat. Around him fell the other great nobles. Of the rear Gardegahard, the king's seneschal, Anselm, Count of the Palace. Dozens of other names recorded carefully by Frankish chroniclers who wanted to memorialize the dead even as they struggled to explain the inexplicable disaster. These were not peasant levies or expendable foot soldiers. These were the cream of Frankish nobility, men whose deaths would leave holes in Charlemagne's administration and military leadership for years to come. The baggage train, that long, vulnerable tale of supplies and treasure, was thoroughly plundered. Everything the Franks had managed to extract from their Spanish campaign. Every piece of equipment, every supply cart, every pack animal, all of it, disappeared into the mountains. Carried off by men who knew 100 hidden paths back to their valleys and villages. The bodies of Frankish nobles, stripped of their valuable armor and weapons, were left scattered across the pass. When dawn finally came and Charlemagne received word of the disaster, when he led the main army racing back to Roncevaux, they found only corpses and silence. The Basques had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. There was no one to fight, no enemy to punish, just the terrible evidence of what had happened, and the knowledge that somewhere in these endless mountains, men were dividing up Frankish gold and laughing at the empire's humiliation. The psychological impact of Roncevaux resonated far beyond the immediate military loss. Charlemagne had lost battles before no commander active for as many years as he had been could avoid occasional defeats. But those defeats had come in conventional warfare, against armies that could be located, confronted, and eventually destroyed through superior resources and persistence. The Saxons might ambush a Frankish column, but Charlemagne could respond by burning Saxon villages until they sued for peace. The Lombards might win a skirmish, but Charlemagne could besiege their cities until their kingdom collapsed. Victory in early medieval warfare was ultimately a matter of resources, and will whoever could sustain the campaign longer. Whoever could absorb more losses and keep fighting would eventually prevail. Roncevaux offered no such clear path to victory. How do you conquer people who won't present themselves for conquest? How do you intimidate a population that can disappear into terrain they know intimately? How do you punish an attack when you can't identify who attacked you? The Frankish army that retreated north from the Pyrenees in August 778 was still formidable, still numerically superior to any force the Basques could assemble. But they understood, in a way that transcended military calculation, that the mountains themselves had rejected them. This was not a defeat that could be avenged with another campaign, another army, another demonstration of imperial might. This was the land itself saying no. The chroniclers who recorded these events struggled to make sense of what had happened. Einhard, Charlemagne's biographer, and one of the greatest scholars of the Carolingian Renaissance, wrote his account decades after the battle. His description is careful, almost clinical in its brevity. He acknowledges the defeat. He could hardly ignore the death of so many prominent nobles, but he frames it in terms that minimize the humiliation. The Basques, in Einhard's telling, are barely mentioned as Basques. They are just the enemy, a faceless force that exploited favorable terrain and then disappeared. There is no analysis of why they attacked, no consideration of Frankish actions that might have provoked them. The destruction of Pamplona, so central to understanding Basque motivations, is not mentioned at all in Einhard's account. This silence is itself revealing. In the carefully managed propaganda of the Carolingian court, Roncevaux was an embarrassment that needed to be contained, explained away, minimized as much as possible. Charlemagne's reign was being constructed as a narrative of uninterrupted Christian triumph, the restoration of Roman imperial glory under the banner of the Church. A devastating defeat at the hands of Christian mountaineers, who were his own subjects, did not fit that narrative. Better to mention it briefly, to honor the noble dead without dwelling on the circumstances of their deaths, and to move on to more edifying topics, like Charlemagne's conquest of Saxony or his coronation as emperor in Rome. But the memory of Roncevaux could not be suppressed entirely. Among the Frankish nobility, the disaster became a cautionary tale about the limits of imperial power, about the dangers of overextension, about the difference between nominal authority and actual control. Charlemagne's empire was vast on maps, drawn by monks in distant scriptoria, but those maps showed borders and boundaries that had little meaning in regions where loyalty shifted with the seasons and armed ensure. Resistance could materialize from any hillside. The Basques had demonstrated that, acknowledging Frankish overlordship in theory and actually submitting to it in practice were two very different things. More significantly, Roncevaux marked the end of Charlemagne's ambitions in Spain. He would never again attempt a major campaign south of the Pyrenees. The Spanish March, the border region that became what is now Catalonia, would slowly expand through the efforts of local counts and military orders. But Charlemagne himself had learned that empire building in Iberia required a different approach than the rapid conquest and forced conversion that worked against Saxon pagans. The Muslims of Al-Andalus were not barbarians who could be overawed by Frankish military might. The terrain favored defenders who knew it intimately. And even Christian populations like the Basques could not be assumed to welcome Frankish intervention. The battle changed the strategic calculus of the Carolingian Empire. Resources that might have been devoted to southern expansion were instead directed elsewhere to the endless, grinding campaigns against the Saxons to the defense of Italy, against Muslim raiders, to the containment of Avar power in the Danube basin. The Pyrenees became not a highway for Christian conquest, but a frontier to be managed cautiously, with local alliances and gradual pressure rather than overwhelming force. It was a subtle shift, visible only in the pattern of campaigns over decades. But it represented a genuine lesson learned from defeat. In the mountains themselves, among the Basque communities scattered across the Pyrenees, Roncevaux became something else entirely. Not a defeat to be forgotten, but a victory to be remembered and celebrated. The exact details of what happened that August day were probably never written down by the Basques themselves. They had no court chroniclers, no learned monks producing histories for posterity. Their culture preserved memory through oral tradition, through songs and stories passed from generation to generation, through place names and local legends that encoded real events in poetic language. But the essence of what Roncevaux meant to the Basques is not hard to reconstruct. They had faced down the greatest military power in Western Europe and won. They had demonstrated that imperial armies could be destroyed, that armor and cavalry and all the tools of conventional warfare were useless against enemies who understood the terrain and refused to fight on the empire's terms. They had avenged. Pamplona had made the Franks pay in blood and gold for their arrogance, and had done it all without losing their own identity or independence in the process. The treasure taken from the Frankish baggage train must have been distributed widely across Basque communities, not hoarded by any single chieftain, but shared among the warriors who had participated in the attack and the villages that had supported them. This was not the centralized resource extraction of an empire, where wealth flowed upward to kings and nobles. This was the economic logic of a warrior culture, where participation in successful raids brought tangible rewards, where courage was rewarded with a share of the spoils, where the community as a whole benefited from defending its territory. The Frankish horses would have been particularly valuable in a mountainous region where cavalry warfare was impracticable. Horses were still essential for travel and transport. The weapons and armor, even if too heavy for Basque fighting styles, could be reworked or traded. The food supplies could feed villages through the winter. The gold and silver could be fashioned into jewelry and ceremonial objects that would mark family prestige for generations. Beyond the material gains, Roncevaux provided something even more valuable: validation of a way of life, proof that the Basques did not need to become part of any empire to survive and prosper. They had watched the Visigoths rule Iberia and then collapse before Muslim invasion. They had seen the Muslims establish Al-Andalus and push north toward Francia. They had observed the Frankish Empire expanding in all directions, absorbing peoples, then cultures, into an administrative structure that promised order and Christian civilization at the cost of local autonomy. And through all of this, the Basques had maintained their distinct identity, their unique language, their traditional social structures. Roncevaux was proof that their strategy, cooperating when necessary, resisting when possible, using geography as a weapon, actually worked. The symbolic weight of the battle grew over time, as decades turned into centuries. As the Carolingian Empire eventually fractured and new political arrangements emerged across Europe, the Basques remained. They would eventually be divided between French and Spanish kingdoms, would face repeated attempts at cultural assimilation and political control, would see their language suppressed and their traditions discouraged. But they persisted, maintained their identity across more than a millennium of pressure from larger powers. And when modern Basques looked back for historical moments that validated their continued existence as a distinct people, Roncevaux was always they're a reminder that empires are temporary, but the mountains endure. That military might means nothing if you don't understand the land. That the refusal to submit can itself be a form of victory. The Frankish sword taken from Count Roland's body, or at least the sword that legend would claim, came from Roncevaux, an artifact heavy with meaning beyond its material value. In Basque communities, such captured weapons were not merely trophies, but symbols of a deeper truth, the finest steel that Frankish smiths could forge. Blessed by bishops and carried by the greatest Christian warriors of the age, had proven insufficient when faced with men who knew the mountains and fought for their homes. The technology of empire, its administrative sophistication and material resources, could be defeated by intimate knowledge of place and fierce commitment to independence. This sword and others, like it, whether real artifacts from the battle or legendary objects that accumulated stories over time, represented a reversal of the expected order. Empires were supposed to win. Civilization was supposed to triumph over barbarism, order over chaos, the sophistication over the simple. The entire ideology of the Carolingian Empire rested on the assumption that Charlemagne and his successors represented a higher form of human organization, that their Christian empire was both morally superior and practically more effective than the fragmented local identities that had characterized post-Roman Europe. Roncevaux suggested that this assumption might be wrong, that there were circumstances where the supposed barbarians had advantages the civilized lacked. The Franks had better weapons, better armor, better horses, better training, more resources, more sophisticated logistics, and the backing of the church. They had every material advantage, every structural benefit that historians traditionally associate with military success. Then they had lost anyway, because they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the conflict they were in. They thought they were fighting a military campaign that would end with either clear victory or negotiated peace. The Basques understood they were defending a way of life that could never be truly conquered, as long as the mountains provided refuge and the community maintained its cohesion. This pattern, imperial power, defeated by local knowledge, technological superiority, undermined by geographic reality. Conventional military might, frustrated by unconventional resistance, would repeat itself throughout history. The Romans had faced similar challenges in these same mountains centuries earlier. The Spanish would encounter it during their own attempts to fully control Basque territories. The French revolutionary government would struggle with it during the Napoleonic Wars, when Basque and Navarre guerrillas made the Pyrenees a nightmare for French logistics. The pattern persisted, because the fundamental dynamic remained constant: people defending their homeland in terrain they intimately understood could frustrate even vastly superior forces. If they refused to fight on the invader's terms, Charlemagne lived another 36 years after Roncevaux, and his accomplishments in those years were remarkable enough to earn him a place among the most significant rulers in European history. He conquered Saxony after decades of brutal campaigning, forcibly converting or exterminating pagans who refused to accept Christianity. He was crowned emperor by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day in the year 800, symbolically reviving the Western Roman Empire for centuries after its collapse. He sponsored a cultural renaissance that preserved countless classical texts, standardized script and liturgy across his domains, and laid the foundations for medieval European civilization. He established administrative systems that would influence European governance for centuries. He died in 814 as Charles the Great, Charlemagne, a name that resonated with imperial grandeur. But he never forgot Roncevaux. In the private moments between public triumphs, in the quiet of his palace at Aachen, where he received reports from across his empire, the memory of that August day must have lingered. He had lost not just an army unit, but some of his closest companions, men who had fought beside him for decades, whose counsel he valued and whose presence at court represented continuity with the early days of his reign. The list of the dead from Roncevaux reads like a roll call of Frankish nobility: Count Roland, the Seneschal Anselm, the Count of the Palace, and dozens of others whose names were carefully recorded even as the circumstances of their deaths were minimized in official accounts. The psychological wound went deeper than grief for fallen friends. Roncevaux represented a failure of the very principle on which Charlemagne's empire was built. The idea that Christian order could and should expand to encompass all peoples. That resistance to this divine plan was futile and would be overcome through superior organization and righteous determination. The Basques had demonstrated that there were limits to what even the most powerful Christian king could achieve. That not every population could be incorporated into empire. That some peoples preferred to risk imperial wrath rather than submit. 2. Imperial authority. This lesson shaped the final decades of Charlemagne's reign in subtle but important ways. He became more cautious about overextension, more willing to consolidate existing territories than to launch speculative campaigns into new regions. The Spanish March remained a frontier zone rather than a jumping-off point for deeper conquest. The borders of Francia stabilized not at natural geographic limits, but at the practical boundaries of what could be effectively controlled and defended. The dream of recreating the Roman Empire in all its territorial extent gradually gave way to a more modest vision of a Christian core in northern Europe. Defended against external enemies, but not constantly expanding at all costs. The Carolingian Empire that Charlemagne bequeathed to his son, Louis the Pious, was impressive in its extent and organization. But it was also fragile in ways that Roncevaux had revealed. It depended on personal loyalty to the emperor, on the ability of a single ruler to coordinate action across vast distances, on military superiority that could be suddenly negated by terrain or tactics. Within a generation of Charlemagne's death, his empire would fracture along linguistic and regional lines, splintering into the kingdoms that would eventually become France, Germany, and Italy. The Basques, meanwhile, would continue to inhabit their mountains, would continue to speak their incomprehensible language, would continue to frustrate any power that tried to fully absorb them. The legend that grew around Roncevaux tells us as much about medieval European culture as it does about the actual battle. The Song of Roland, written down in the 11th century but drawing on older oral traditions, transformed the historical disaster into an epic of Christian martyrdom and feudal loyalty. In the poem, Roland becomes a hero of impossible courage, who refuses to call for help until it is too late, who dies fighting against overwhelming odds of Muslim Saracens rather than against Christian Basques. The embarrassing reality of defeat at the hands of nominal subjects was transmuted into the inspiring fiction of heroic last stands against the enemies of Christendom. This transformation reveals how uncomfortable Roncevaux remained in Christian European consciousness. The actual story, Christian Franks destroyed by Christian Basques, in revenge for the destruction of a Christian city, did not fit the narrative framework of crusade and holy war that increasingly dominated medieval European ideology. The Basques had to be erased from the story, replaced by Muslims who could serve as acceptable enemies, tragic opponents whose very presence justified the Christian deaths. Rather than raising uncomfortable questions about imperial overreach and local resistance, the historical Roland, whoever he really was beneath the layers of legend, probably died in confusion and chaos. Cut down by javelins thrown from the forest, struggling to understand how an empire's might could dissolve so quickly. In the mountain shadows, the legendary Roland died in glorious single combat, his sword Durendal raised against the Saracen hordes, his ivory horn, Oliphant sounding one final call for aid that would bring Charlemagne racing back to avenge his death. One death is the messy reality of imperial defeat. The other is the comfortable fiction that empires tell. themselves to avoid confronting their limitations, but beneath the legend, the historical truth persisted for those who cared to look. The chronicles, even in their carefully sanitized versions, could not completely erase what had happened. Einhard's biography mentioned the battle, however briefly. Other sources filled in details the names of the dead, the location of the ambush, the fate of the baggage train. Later, medieval historians, comparing sources and analyzing narratives, could reconstruct, at least, the outline of the truth. The Basques had won. The empire had lost. No amount of legendary embellishment could change these basic facts. The mountain pass of Roncevaux still exists, of course. Modern roads cross the Pyrenees at multiple points, and the ancient route through Roncevaux is now a highway where trucks and cars move easily between Spain and France. The dense forests have been managed and cleared. The steep slopes have been terraced and cultivated. The remoteness that made medieval ambushes possible has been conquered by engineering and infrastructure. A tourist can drive through Roncevaux in minutes, perhaps stopping to read a historical marker that mentions the battle in brief. Sanitized terms, but for those with imagination and historical awareness, the ghosts are still there. In the forested slopes, above the modern road, in the steep valleys where no highway would ever be built. In the remote peaks that even now remain wild and difficult in all these places, the memory of August 778 lingers. This is where an empire learned that it could not go everywhere and conquer everything. This is where a people demonstrated that survival sometimes depends not on matching the enemy's strength, but on refusing to fight the enemy's kind of battle. This is where the assumptions of imperial invincibility shattered against the reality of mountains that could not be conquered, and people who refused to be absorbed. The Basque language, Euskara, is still spoken in these mountains, and the valleys on both sides of the modern French-Spanish border. It remains one of the great mysteries of European linguistics, isolate, unrelated to any other known tongue, survivor of millennia, during which Indo-European languages spread across Europe. Its persistence is itself a monument to Basque resistance, to the refusal to be linguistically or culturally assimilated, even when surrounded by larger, more powerful neighbors. Every Basque speaker is a living connection to the people who ambushed Charlemagne's army. A reminder that some things transcend empires and endure despite all pressures to disappear. The political landscape of modern Europe is vastly different from the world of 778. Charlemagne's empire is gone, fragmented into nation-states that would be unrecognizable to 8th century Franks. The Basques themselves are divided between Spanish and French jurisdictions, subject to laws they did not write, and borders they did not choose. But the essential dynamic that Roncevaux illuminated the tension between imperial power and local identity, between centralized control and regional autonomy, means unresolved. Modern Basque nationalism, the ongoing debates about autonomy and independence, the periodic violence that has marked Basque-Spanish relations in recent decades, of this echoes themes that were already ancient when Roland rode into the mountains 12 centuries ago. There is a particular quality to military defeats in difficult terrain that haunts the imagination more than defeats in open battle. When one army meets another on a plain or in a valley, when lines are drawn in formations and clash, there is a comprehensible logic to victory and defeat. Someone was stronger, more numerous, better led, luckier in the crucial moment. But when an army simply disappears into mountains or jungle or desert, when soldiers march into terrain and never march out, when the very landscape becomes the enemy, these defeats touch something deeper in the human psyche. They remind us that for all our technology and organization, nature still has the power to swallow our ambitions whole. Roncevaux belongs to this category of defeats. The Franks did not lose because they were weak or poorly trained or badly led. They lost because they fundamentally misunderstood where they were and who they were fighting. They brought the assumptions of lowland warfare into an environment where those assumptions meant nothing. They expected conventional resistance that could be overcome with conventional force. Instead, they encountered something older and more fundamental: the fury of people defending their homeland. Amplified by intimate knowledge of terrain that turned every forest into a forest into a killing ground, the sword of the empire. Blessed and forged and wielded with righteous confidence, could cut through armor and bone, but not through mountain fog. The weight of Frankish mail that stopped enemy blades became a burden when steep trails demanded agility. The coordination and discipline that made Frankish armies so formidable required visibility and communication that mountain warfare denied. Every advantage the Franks possessed became neutral or transformed into a disadvantage. Every strategic choice they had made, the long column, the separation of the rear guard from the main army, the focus on protecting the valuable baggage train, became a vulnerability. The Basques exploited with the efficiency of men who had probably been planning this ambush for days. In the aftermath, when Charlemagne stood among the dead and realized the scope of what had happened, he must have understood that this was a different kind of defeat. He could avenge it by burning Basque villages, by ravaging their territory, by trying to impose punitive control over the mountains. But what would that accomplish? The Basques would retreat deeper into the hills, would scatter and regroup, would wait for the next opportunity. You cannot conquer mountains, cannot occupy terrain that requires constant vigilance and provides the endless opportunities for ambush. You can only negotiate with the people who live there, can only hope to establish relationships that make cooperation more attractive than resistance. The final lesson of Roncevaux emerges not from the battle itself, but from what happened afterward, or rather, what did not happen. Charlemagne did not launch a campaign of revenge against the Basques. He did not return with a larger army to punish them for their attack. He did not try to systematically conquer and occupy Basque territories, as he had done with Saxony. The Spanish March, when it eventually formed, gave Basque regions considerable autonomy within the broader Frankish structure. This was not mercy or magnanimity. This was pragmatic recognition that some populations could not be conquered in any meaningful sense, that attempting to do so would consume resources better spent elsewhere, that some frontiers were better managed through accommodation than through force. This pragmatism represented a maturity in Charlemagne's statecraft that would characterize the remainder of his reign. He remained aggressive in expanding Christian power and consolidating his control over core Frankish territories, but he became more selective about when and where to commit resources, more willing to accept nominal rather than actual authority in peripheral regions, more aware that the glory of conquest had to be weighed against the cost of maintaining control. Roncevaux taught him that empires have limits, not just of resources, but of capability, that some tasks simply cannot be accomplished regardless of how much power you can bring to bear. This lesson, learned at such terrible cost in the Pyrenees, shaped the Carolingian Empire that emerged from Charlemagne's long reign. It was an empire that knew its boundaries, that did not confuse the map with the territory, that understood that drawing borders on parchment and actually controlling the land within those borders were two very different achievements. The administrative structure: Charlemagne developed the system of counts and marches, the reliance on local nobles to maintain order in their regions, the acceptance of varying degrees of autonomy within the broader empire reflected the understanding That power had to be negotiated with reality. That theoretical authority meant nothing if it could not be practically enforced. The Basques, for their part, had demonstrated a principle that would echo through history: that the desire for independence and the intelligent use of geography could frustrate even the mightiest empires. They did not need to match Frankish military power or adopt Frankish political structures. They only needed to make the cost of conquest higher than any empire was willing to pay, to make their territory more trouble than it was worth, to persist until the empire moved on to easier targets. This was not the heroic resistance of epic poetry, where brave warriors died gloriously in suicidal charges against overwhelming odds. This was the practical resistance of people who understood that survival is its own victory, that not losing is sometimes the same as winning, that empires are temporary, but the mountains endure. In the gathering dusk of that August evening in 778, as Basque warriors melted back into the forests, carrying Frankish gold and weapons, as the last sounds of battle faded into the mountain silence, as the bodies of Roland and his companions grew cold on the rocky ground in that moment, something fundamental shifted in the balance between empire and autonomy in early medieval Europe. The shift was subtle, visible only in hindsight, but it was real. An empire had reached its limit. A people had demonstrated that some territories simply could not be absorbed. The certainties of imperial expansion had met the realities of terrain and culture and come up short. The Frankish soldiers who survived to bring news of the disaster back to Charlemagne carried with them more than reports of casualties and lost treasure. They carried the knowledge that empires were not invincible, that Christian righteousness did not guarantee victory, that the most sophisticated military in Western Europe could be utterly destroyed by farmers and shepherds who knew the ground, then refused to fight fair. This knowledge would spread through the Frankish army, would influence the tactics and strategy of future campaigns, would inject a note of caution into the triumphalism that characterized Carolingian propaganda. For the Basques, the victory at Roncevaux validated their entire approach to dealing with more powerful neighbors. They had survived Roman conquest by being too scattered, too suppressed, too poor to be worth the cost of occupation, too familiar with their terrain to be fully controlled. They had endured Visigothic rule by maintaining their language and customs. Even while nominally accepting Christian overlords, they had outlasted Muslim expansion by being too remote and too difficult to be worth the effort of complete conquest. Now they had demonstrated that even the great Charlemagne, whose power seemed unlimited and whose ambitions knew no bounds, could not simply march through their territory and expect submission. The sword taken from Roland's body, if such a trophy actually existed beyond legend, would have been more than a weapon. It would have been a tangible symbol of what the victory meant. Here was the finest military technology the Franks could produce, carried by their greatest warrior, blessed by their holiest priests, wielded in service of what they believed was God's plan for Christian Europe. And it had failed. Not because the Basques had better swords, or stronger faith, or more righteous cause, but because they understood something the Franks did not, that some battles cannot be won with swords at all, that some territories cannot be held with conventional military force, that some peoples will always choose resistance over submission, regardless of the cost. This truth, written in Frankish blood on the slopes of Roncevaux, would outlast the Carolingian Empire, would outlast medieval feudalism, would echo through the centuries. Whenever empires tried to extend their control into mountains, where local knowledge trumped external power, the Vietnamese would understand it when they fought France and America. The Afghans would understand it when they faced British, Soviet, and American occupation. The principle was always the same: empires can occupy roads and cities can control. Populations in flatlands and valleys can impose their will wherever conventional military force can be brought to bear. But mountains belong to the people who live there, and no empire can change this fundamental reality, no matter how much gold they spend or how many soldiers they sacrifice. The sun sets over Roncevaux every evening, as it has for billions of years, as it will continue to do long after the last memory of Charlemagne and the Basques has faded from human consciousness. The mountains endure. The forests grow and are cut and grow again. The streams that run down from the peaks follow the same channels they carved in the Ice Age. The human dramas played out in this landscape, the ambitions of kings, the resistance, the peoples, the clash of empires and identities are tiny flickers of activity against the deep time of geology and ecology. But for those brief moments when human history is being made, when choices and chances converge to create events that reshape the world, these mountains witnessed something that mattered. They saw an empire reach too far. They saw a people refuse to submit. They saw the sword of Christendom broken against the shields of Christian mountaineers who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. They saw glory and ambition and carefully laid plans dissolve into chaos and death and the bitter knowledge of defeat. The ghost of Count Roland, if such things exist, surely walks those mountain paths. Still, not the legendary Roland of epic poetry, who dies dramatically, calling for rescue and fighting to the last breath against impossible odds. But the real Roland, whoever he was, who probably died confused and angry, struck down by enemies he never saw, dying for a campaign that achieved nothing, and a king whose ambitions led him into disaster. That Roland, the historical figure beneath the legend, deserves to be remembered too. His death and the deaths of thousands of others in Roncevaux Pass were not glorious martyrdom in service of Christ. They were the price of imperial overreach, the cost of misjudging terrain and people, the inevitable consequence of assuming that might makes right and that umpires can go anywhere they choose. The Basques who survived that evening probably did not think of themselves as making history, or demonstrating eternal truths about power and resistance. They thought of themselves as defending their homes, avenging Pamplona, taking advantage of an opportunity to strike back at an invading army. They fought not for ideology or empire, but for the immediate, concrete goal of protecting their way of life against external threats. That their victory would resonate across centuries, would become a symbol of successful resistance against imperial power, would inspire other peoples facing similar challenges. None of this could have been known to them in the moment, but history is made by people who do not know they are making it, by soldiers who fight for immediate goals without understanding the long-term consequences, by decisions made in the heat of the moment that shape centuries to come. Roncevaux became significant, not because anyone planned for it to be significant, but because it revealed truths about power and geography and human nature that transcended the immediate circumstances of a single ambush in the Pyrenees. It showed that umpires have limits. It showed that local knowledge is a form of power. It showed that sometimes the most sophisticated military force in the world can be defeated by people armed with nothing but determination and intimate understanding of their homeland. These are lessons that empires never want to learn, truths they consistently ignore until reality forces them to acknowledge the obvious. Charlemagne was not the first ruler to discover that mountains cannot be conquered, and he would not be the last. But for that one August day in 778, in a narrow pass where the forest meets the stone, the lesson was taught with perfect clarity. An empire came to the mountains. The mountains did not care. The people who lived there cared very much. And when the dust settled and the survivors limped away, everyone involved understood that something important had happened, even if they disagreed about what that something meant. The sword of the empire lay broken on the mountain. The ghosts of the Basques still walk those trails, and the truth endures that no power, however great, can conquer everything it desires. Some places, some peoples, some freedoms cannot be taken, only defended, again and again, for as long as the mountains stand and the human spirit refuses to accept chains.